Hello. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to day 3 of the DeNicola Center Ethics and Culture Fall Conference. Thanks. So my name is Mike Rippey. I'm the Digital and Special Projects Program Manager at the Snipe Museum of Art here at the University of Notre Dame campus. And just for some future shameless marketing, next year we're gonna have the new Racklin Murphy Museum of Art available. So that's gonna be, and it's gonna open right around the time this conference happens again next year. So very excited for that. So if you're in the right place, you're at the Fashioned by Human Skill and Imagination, Creation, and Art session. We have our 3 panelists here. We'll start with Andrew. Andrew Moran is an associate professor of English at the University of Dallas and director of its summer Rome semester. He is the author of essays on Shakespeare, Johnson, Milton, and Waugh. Hope I said that right. Okay. And then we have Andrew Wilson Smith, a South Bend native, is an artist and teacher with studio practice specializing in sacred art, having studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art and Florence Academy of Art, and having completed apprenticeships with several talented sculptors. Smith established AWS Sculpture Studio in 2006 and has completed commissions for numerous religious organizations and educational institutions. Prominent projects include narrative scenes and apostles carved into the portal of Clear Creek Abbey in Holbert, Oklahoma, architectural sculpture elements at Sacred Heart Cathedral in Knoxville, Tennessee, and a limestone baptismal font for St. Philip the Apostle Catholic Church in Flower Mound, Texas. Smith is currently carving life-size marble statues of Saints Peter and Paul for St. Joseph's Cathedral in Jefferson City, Missouri. More information can be found at his website, andrewwilsonsmith.com. Then we have Michael Krom, is the director of the Benedictine Leadership Studies at St. Vincent College, an undergraduate program that shapes servant leaders rooted in the teachings of Catholic Church and in Benedictine spirituality. In addition, he serves as chair of the philosophy department. He recently authored a second book, Justice and Charity, an introduction to Aquinas's moral, economic, and political thought through Baker Academic Press, which grew out of his efforts to provide seminarians at St. Vincent Seminary with a solid foundation for Catholic social teaching. Currently, he works on the history and nature of Benedictine education, and his focus on music stems from his commitment to forming undergraduates rooted in Catholic Benedictine liberal arts education. So we'll start with Andrew Moran, and you can stand at the podium or...
Good morning. The title of my talk today is The Baroque Rhythms of Creation in the Tempest. William Shakespeare's The Tempest begins with the master assigning the boatswain work necessary for his salvation and others' salvation. An opening shipwreck during a storm is the first of many allusions to Virgil's Aeneid and to Scripture, as another master, Prospero, from the primal chaos creates order and sets in motion his plan of mercy. The allusions, going from Genesis to Exodus to the Gospels in the first 3 acts, seemingly correspond in their order to the movement of the Bible, as if salvation history were being staged. Prospero's Revel's speech in Act 4, when all things shall dissolve, is another contrapuntally twofold allusion to Virgil and the Bible, to the dissolution of the bees in the Georgics as they, with their share of divine intelligence, are remade and climb the high heavens, and to 2 Peter, when after the heavens are dissolved, God will create new heavens and a new earth. Act 5 also looks toward the end of time, with the characters preparing for a wedding in Naples, Neapolis, the new city. So too ends the book of Revelation. That attentiveness to movement in time in the Tempest is evident too in its Virgilian beginning, in medias res, in the middle of things, so that we go back and forth between now, a word that's repeated over 50 times in the play, and the past and the future. The very minute bids Miranda ope her ear, but that means to look into the dark backward and abysm of time. The past a necessary preparation for the future in Naples. In Italy, too, Prospero will prepare for his future. Every third thought shall be my grave. The Tempest speeds towards its climax, its running time corresponding to its dramatic time, its mere 9 scenes pushing ahead through concluding phrases such as, "Come follow, go safely on, lead the way." But in its focus on time, specifically on how past, present, and future intertwine and press against each other, it is Baroque. Like his protagonist Prospero, Shakespeare, writing in 1611, after Caravaggio has revolutionized Western painting, and a few years before Gian Lorenzo Bernini begins to sculpt marvels, is a Baroque artist. I would like to include Shakespeare with Bernini and the architect Francesco Borromini to consider how a Baroque sense of time and movement linked to a Baroque understanding of the human creator who shares in the divine force, freedom, and copiousness. Shakespeare, in his prosody, his poetic techniques, is like Bernini and Borromini, as is Prospero in his magic. Yet the alchemist only completes his project by recognizing his dissimilarity to the divine creator. And by the way, there are handouts with some of the passages from Shakespeare I'm going to be quoting, as well as images from Bernini and Borromini, if I'm not sure if there are any left, but I'll be referring to those. It is a staple of art history classes to compare the Renaissance and the Baroque through Michelangelo and Bernini's Davids, a contrast that highlights distinct ideas about time and space. Michelangelo's, fit for a niche, captures a moment of repose, one moment in time to contemplate detachedly. Bernini's breaks the plane and enters the viewer's space, as the slinging of the rock means that an arm thrusts forth, a leg stands back, a torso twists. That moment, after David has begun his motion, before the rock has struck Goliath, extends the drama, situating the viewer within a whole sequence of what has happened, is happening, is to come, and inviting him to move around the statue. The architectural theorist Christian Norberg Schultz, noting Descartes' idea that spatial extension is the basic property of all things, understands the Baroque in terms of radiating forces without spatial limit. David is extending violently, gracefully, in space and time. It is worth noting that the model for his contorted, intense face is Bernini's own. Rather than free, pre-existent form from matter, a la Michelangelo, the Baroque artist is to exert muscular control over the elements, as does the god of Genesis, as does Prospero. I have bedimmed the noontide sun, called forth the mutinous winds, and twixt the green sea and the azured vault set roaring war. To the dread rattling thunder have I given fire, and rifted Jove's stout oak with his own bolt. Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, oped and led 'em forth by my so potent art. Seemingly antithetical to such theatrical force is Borromini's miniature masterpiece, the Church of San Carlo, with its simple geometric shapes and whitewashed austerity. But here too, the principles of extension and control are operative. The undulation of its facade comes from concave sides and a convex center pushing against each other. Its harmony, then, is not the result of static forms, but instead hints at the perpetual motion of a creator balancing contending energies so that the center of the facade juts forward into space. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Baroque art was often held in contempt. The emphasis on extension and force may indeed be objectionable, as in politics it manifested itself in the aggressive centralization of early modern regimes. The emphasis on the creator's force may also explain the popularity of trompe-l'oeil, the artist's power to trick the eye, as in the Church of Sant'Ignazio with its false dome, or Prospero's mask of goddesses to celebrate his daughter's engagement, which he dismisses as a vanity of my art. But what was later sneered at, as John Rupert Martin points out, served a spiritual purpose, to make participants of spectators so that they are pointed toward supersensory realities. Juno, Iris, and Ceres invite the newly engaged Miranda and Ferdinand to enter a sacred realm. In the best Baroque works, the creator's energy originates not in the willful exercise of power, but in his ebullient sense of godlike freedom. This spiritual understanding may follow from a Catholic anthropology, in particular from the Tridentine teaching in opposition to the doctrines of the Reformers, on the restoration of the divine image in man through baptism and his subsequent liberty of the will and capacity to cooperate with God in his sanctification. Whatever the case, the dynamism of a Borromini facade and the confidence in the free exercise of one's strength seen in Bernini's David are evident too in the Tempest, in its diction and meter. Russ MacDonald notes the looseness of the line in late Shakespeare, its free movement, and the radical compression, the packing as much thought as possible into the space of a sentence. As Virginia Mason Vaughan points out, words are conspicuously omitted, leaving the observer to make the line coherent by supplying an all-important noun, pronoun, verb, adverb. For example, after the three men of sin draw their swords on Ariel, the Spirit speaks of their bemocked at stabs. Huh? In a three-word compound, Ariel succinctly tells them, I'm a spirit without a body, and so I mock your attempt to stab me, you big dummies. 3 words. He makes sense not syntactically, but contextually, because the poet can press words together to make a complex meaning jump out. Likewise, frequent elision means that the remaining syllables punch harder. And just as the conventions of syntax and pronunciation are reconstituted, so too in The Tempest and The Winter's Tale, Shakespeare's other Baroque masterpiece. As George T. Wright explains, is the relationship between line, sentence, phrase, and meter reconstituted. 20 years earlier, Shakespeare had written lines like those from Henry VI, Part 2 on the handout, in which the iambic pentameter is steady and the end stopping inveterate. I wonder how the king escaped our hands. While we pursued the horsemen of the north, he slyly stole away and left his men. Whereat the great lord of Northumberland, whose warlike ears could never brook retreat, and so on. But in The Tempest, Ferdinand proclaims his love to Miranda with Bernini-esque propulsion and Borromini-esque undulation. His words flow into hers in shared lines, expressive of their mutual love. This love can no more be end-stopped than can Canute command the waves. as the constant enjambment with an extra final syllable has lines roll and crash into each other. The next syllable, the extra syllables, 13 syllables in one iambic pentameter line, mean that the pentameter surges to express his love. From the occasional absence of caesura, creating longer syntactical units, white waters of emotion stream forth. All the while, alliteration adds to the cascading effect. No, noble mistress, 'tis fresh morning with me when you are by at night. I do beseech you, chiefly that I might set it in my prayers. What is your name? Miranda. Oh, my father, I have broke your hest to say so. Admired Miranda. Indeed, the top of admiration, worth what's dearest to the world. Full many a lady I have eyed with best regard, and many a time the harmony of their tongues hath into bondage brought my too diligent ear. For several virtues have I liked several women, never any with so full soul, but some defect in her did quarrel with the noblest grace she owed, and put it to the foil. But you, oh you, so perfect and so peerless, are created of every creature's best. This is not free verse, but the poet expresses the intensity of a young man in love by masterful control of a cornucopia of prosodic means. Prospero, too, creates through control of various and contradictory elements. The magician is an image of the dramatist as he rules over his island kingdom, balancing and ultimately harmonizing the subplots, the noble young lovers, the wandering royal party, the drunken servants. Alchemy was predicated on the control and the balance of the four elements. Prospero's two servants are associated with those elements. The spirit Ariel with the higher ones, air and fire, and Caliban with the lower, water and earth. But according to the pseudoscience's doctrines, the alchemist himself must be rightly balanced. When Prospero stages the mask, his spirits play goddesses associated with air, earth, and water, but Venus, with her fires of love, is not invited. Mars's hot minion plays wanton charms upon young lovers. Ferdinand, aware of the danger, promises that the white cold virgin snow upon his heart will abate the fire in the blood as the couple prepares for marriage. Then again, Hymen's torch cannot be lighted without fire. And as Aristotle teaches about fertility, heat as well as moisture are necessary. It is ironic that Prospero excludes fire, as what imbalances him is his own heat. Though he had indicated that his plans are benevolent, his fiery anger, provoked by memories of betrayal, threatens his project. In his anger, he keeps Caliban from the fresh springs, so that the bitter servant has access only to impure waters. When Prospero had in their Edenic first days taught Caliban how to name the bigger light and how the less, he would give him water with berries in it. But now he punishes with cramps and dry convulsions, dryness a property of fire. As for the island's fallen atom, there is no mercy. In return, the desiccated Caliban will guzzle Stephanos' liquor in his yearning for a merciful God, and curse Prospero with a southwest wind. To create, Prospero must balance his hot and dry with what is cold and wet. That action only occurs when he becomes passive and listens to Ariel describe how the punishment of his enemies has provoked the cold and wet tears of his one-time benefactor, Gonzalo. His tears run down his beard like winter's drops. Gonzalo's sympathy provokes Prospero's. He remembers that he is one of their kind, a man who relishes all as sharply passion as they do. He too is subject to passion, to anger. He too elementally imbalanced. Paradoxically, to complete his work, he must renounce his power, which had tempted him to forget himself, to forget the bonds of sin and time which lead to death. The magician, therefore, breaks his staff and burns his books in an act of kenosis, an emptying of self, as he acknowledges his dissimilarity to the Creator. Human creation follows from an exuberant recognition of godlike power and freedom, from a sharing in the divine attributes, so that the artist may cooperate with God, as the bosun cooperates with the master. But this exhilarating self-understanding is tempered by the hard realities of sin and death. To forget that, to be a Baconian master of nature, is to lose one's humanity, specifically the quality of sympathy which follows from the recognition of one's neediness. The human creator, like and unlike his creator, cooperates with the master when he holds in balance force and weakness, freedom and constraint, copiousness and emptiness, eternity and the grave. The only power left Prospero is prayer, as was the case with the mariners in the first scene, who on the brink of death cried, "All lost, to prayers, all lost." In the epilogue, Prospero breaks the plane to ask for mercy. Again, the Tempest responds to the Aeneid contrapuntally through biblical allusions to the Beatitudes. In contrast to Aeneas's unnerving violence, the play ends harmoniously because the merciful Prospero can hope for mercy. In the epilogue's meter, there remains a hint of the magician's power, a change to trochaic tetrameter with terminal catalexis, that is, a 7-syllable line beginning and ending with a stress, beloved of witches and cheerleaders. Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's my own. But the chant works as if part of a fugue, as it is interwoven with iambic tetrameter, while the enjambment, the uninhibited movement from line to line, keeps us from being spellbound. After one last enchanting heptasyllabic line about despair, prayer concludes the play with iambic balance and octosyllabic extension, 8 being the number of eternity. And my ending is despair unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. Only mercy bursts forth trochaically. The seemingly dissonant verbs pierces and assault speak of not how Aeneas murders Turnus, but how human life may extend into eternity. In the final couplet, the only one with no metrical irregularity and no caesuras, the iambs intimate the enduring harmony of a creation recreated through mercy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and it's an honor to be here today. Good morning. So, Whistler's Madonna. It's a hypothetical painting that I like to think about sometimes. I imagine a sort of alternative history scenario in which the bishops of Boston and Baltimore were competing with one another as to who could commission Whistler and Sargent to make magnificent paintings for themselves. You imagine Augustus St. Gaudens creating sculpture for the Catholic Church during the late 19th century. All of these things didn't happen, and I want to talk a little bit today about at least my views of these past few centuries in terms of sacred ecclesiastical art in the context of the Western Church, and look forward a little bit into what's happening today. So I'd like to start with Houdon. In my opinion, Houdon represents the last time that the greatest artist alive worked for the Catholic Church. And it was his first 2 commissions, 1760s for Santa Maria degli Angeli in Rome, his John the Baptist, and his Saint Bruno. And this is, the tale between a kind of Rococo period and neoclassicism. And Houdon, as a very young man, was extremely conscientious about these commissions. For instance, he developed St. John as an écorché before completing the sculpture so that he would get every detail of the muscular correct. The écorché actually has become more famous than the statue of St. John the Baptist, and it populates cast halls from that period forward, and medical, textbooks and so on. The Bruno, however, I think is an even stronger work of art. It's, contemplating it in person, I think, is as profound, as meaningful as any of the great sculptors of the Renaissance and so on. And, rather than spending a career making votive statues, Houdon spends his career making statues of Voltaire. So the rest of his career, a very long one, is devoted to kind of the sculpture of the Enlightenment, Enlightenment figures, revolutionary fathers of America. He sort of toured the United States, and some of his portraits of the founding fathers are just the very best thing of that period. And I do not know this for sure, but I feel confident that had the church demanded his talents and brought the right incentives to the table, he would have happily continued to make things in the earlier vein. But this great talent and many others were kind of side-directed in a new direction during this period. So getting back to our 19th century alternative history, Edwin Austin Abbey, well-known painter from the period contemporary with Whistler and Sargent, and in this same circle, produced this set of murals for the Boston Public Library, and it's a depiction of the Holy Grail cycle. I like to imagine something like this being, a style conceivably used, say, in the Cathedral of Baltimore or Boston, and it would be maybe not to everyone's taste, but at least it would be quite interesting, moving the ball forward, making new ground. So just to go over to what's really going on in the Cathedral of Boston, Massachusetts, a very noble, 19th century American church architecture, often very high quality, and a noble sort of remembrance of European styles, especially Gothic. And as you get into the interior, I would contend that it tends to become a sort of mass-produced factory from Italy and other parts of Europe, sort of exporting a sort of medium quality art into this church in the United States. So a stained glass window, people may find it quite admirable, have a relationship with it, but it's sort of 3 or 4 generations removed from Raphael. And this is true, I think, to not be hypercritical, but to understand that much of the art in Europe and America of this period is really, the product of a kind of second or third option in terms of who the artists are who are being commissioned, and the best people working in these periods are working for high society and starting to get into sort of museum pieces, salons, and things like this. And the church really contents itself during this time with the kind of more derivative outputs of art factories and so forth. I think moving on to the 20th century, there is a new infusion of interest in the church into more individualistic artists and styles. I think we can look at something like the Church of St. Leopold in Vienna as the prototype. Here we see a mixture of elements. We see traditional elements, but they're reimagined and used in different ways. For instance, the colonnade on the front of the church, isn't actually a load-bearing colonnade. It's become more of a art piece. You have the influence of Art Nouveau styles, and I think really this is a quite admirable design. The artwork itself also is interesting. There's a spirit, there's an infusion of life here. And I think we're all familiar with more, this is the sort of prototype of a lot of post-war American ecclesiastical architecture, the suburban rite of the church, you might say. And it doesn't get better than this. It gets a little bit worse. But there is an attempt, so we have to kind of hold these things in tandem. There's a rejection of that sort of derivative 19th century style, and there's an attempt to breathe new life into this important area of the life of the church, its artistic expression. I think the high points of the 20th century in terms of sacred art can be seen with, especially Notre Dame is a great campus for this, to look at Ivan Mestrovic's work, his Pietà at the Basilica, and just across the street, the Swinson Madonna. And you have characters like Dali, interesting, not really he's not painting altarpieces. These are kind of museum pieces, his various crucifix paintings. But definitely an infusion of intense thought into his work, ideas about representation, about new vantage points for viewing, all of these things. So, I wanted to highlight the best kinds of things from this period, and it's hard to think about. I mean, these are admirable. They're hard to have relationship with, I would say. They're hard to view as something you would want to light a candle in front of, to, contemplate in a sort of meditative way. So there are high points, but there are also problems with these movements. There's problems here. And there's been, whether you like it or not, a rejection of all of these movements of the 20th century. The contemporary Catholic faithful are not interested in continuing in that vein. And so that leads us into our more contemporary period. There has been, over the last 20, 25 years, a complete sea change in contemporary sacred architecture. So the church has embraced this revival of traditional design, a lot of classicism, remembering the Gothic period. And this is what's happening, and it's mostly happening in the South and mostly in flyover country. So this is Knoxville Cathedral here, recently built. And you can see on the far left, my left, the previous church, a mid-century kind of box. And that's now the parish hall, as it should be. And there's a beautiful Renaissance-inspired cathedral designed by James McCreary Architects out of DC. And just a very, people love it. Whether you want to call it kitsch or any of the other things you might, this is a well-loved space. It will be used and admired for its liturgical use for many years to come. I was able to be involved with this project and provided the interior architectural sculpture plaster work for this project, and it was a real honor to be involved. And so if you are ever passing through Knoxville, go in and take a look. And admire this space. And I would just say, try not to look up. You look up in the dome, a beautiful, as you see here, Renaissance dome, quite large scale. It's hard to tell from the picture, but it's very large. And the interior was painted by a contemporary kind of art factory, this Evergreen Architectural Arts. They kind of raided Granny's Holy Card collection and pasted the apostles up there. And just to me, seeing that and working on that site, and not for myself, I'm not a painter, but just imagine the opportunity, the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a serious painter to take that dome, make a sort of masterpiece of a composition, and maybe that still is an opportunity in the future. This church was built to last. This is a 200-year amortization versus the 30-year builds that are more familiar. And so I think this structure will have a long life, and I think there will possibly be an opportunity in the future for that dome to be repainted. But that puts us right at the crossroads of where we are today. The modernist influence is over. Nobody's building that. Nobody wants it. You can still admire it and have it, but it's not moving forward. And so now we're at this crossroads where, modernism has been rejected, and there's going to be some kind of traditional movement going forward, some kind of revival. Now, does that mean a kind of return to 19th century stasis, or does it mean a return to a traditional approach to art making, to design, that lets us be part of this long kind of tradition in our heritage, but also have some degree of invention, some degree of moving forward artistically, bringing new ideas, new artistic concepts to light. Thank you. And so I want to just highlight a few artists today that are working and doing quite interesting things. Jonathan Pajot is a Greek Orthodox icon carver and working firmly within the tradition of iconography, but bringing a lot of life to his works, things that you're not seeing typically. Look up Jonathan Pajot if you're not familiar. Daniel Mitsui, also an Indiana native, doing beautiful, illumination, illustration of biblical scenes, bringing things like symbolism, history, Old Testament. Right now he's illustrating the Bible in a major work. The central images from his project, the Summa Pictoria. Bringing the Old Testament back, bringing different things into the equation. Another great artist working today, Matthew Connor, and again, obviously inspired by medieval painting, but I don't think we would mistake these for any historical object. It would be hard to make that mistake. He has definitely brought a new approach, a new mentality, incorporating humor and all sorts of things into this. I love his St. Joseph painting there. A couple of my projects, this was Clear Creek Abbey, some carvings of the portal for that church, and again, a look at Romanesque, but a reinterpretation, not trying to create a sort of historical artifact, but again, trying to reincorporate the Old Testament. This is something they never did in the 19th century. You don't see, you just get statues of saints from that period, So the apostles here. A couple other projects in a similar vein, inspired by medieval things, but also incorporating other areas. The Ecstasy of Saint Imelda, for example, designed to serve as a reliquary. again, the Enlightenment made fun of us Catholics and our relics and said they would build a battleship out of the pieces of the Holy Cross, right? And then we stopped. We took that criticism and we said, okay, I guess, you know, incorporating relics into our worship is too embarrassing. And so to reintroduce these kinds of practices is going to be part of moving forward. That central image is a baptismal font. And the client approached me saying, can you reproduce this 13th century font that we've discovered in England that's exactly what we want? And I said, I'd be happy to, but also can I convince you, can we reimagine the decorative motifs and come up with a new set of imagery for these sculptural elements? And that they agreed to do that. And so we got to do a much more complicated composition, given this is sort of the tree of life. So the bottom register shows the flower of each of these trees, and the upper register shows the fruit. And this is replacing what was in the prototype simple motifs of decorative elements. Thank you. And you know, a great project I got to do in Lancaster, Ohio, this mosaic image of Christ, and rooted very much in, you know, early Catholic imagery, but allowed to explore in different directions. So mixing some things up in terms of the mosaic, but also approaching more personally the architectural framework. So that's a plaster frame, columns for the door, and so on. There's that lintel showing a heavenly Jerusalem, but it's composed of the buildings in this town that are immediately surrounding the neighborhood of the church. And so people get to interact with that and recognize their local landmarks. The columns, it's hard to see here, but those are composed of decorative plaster sort of panels that I made by taking impressions of patterned glass from the 19th century. And this town of Lancaster had been one of the central factories, and still is actually, of patterned glass. And just seeing the interaction of people coming in, touching the patterns, reflecting on the fact that their grandfather had worked in those factories and so on. There are opportunities. Any given situation will give you opportunities for a new idea, for some form of invention. And I think that's a great example. And finally, just a little glimpse into my studio practice here in South Bend. And this is an exciting project that I'm working on right now, these statues of St. Peter and Paul that will be life-size in marble. And so that just gives you a taste, hopefully something to think about, and contribute to this conversation as it is ongoing today. So thank you very much.
To Mike. I'm going to transition to music, and so I teach classical music in the soul at St. Vincent College, and this talk is probably a poor advertisement for if you just want to listen to music, because there won't be any music. I don't have time for that, but maybe it'll convince you then to take interest in the class. It's an online class, so if you're interested, let me know. So we really have three parts here. Start with a classical understanding of music in relation to the to cosmic order, and then the modern rejection of that. And by modern as a philosopher, I mean really starting with Machiavelli, working up to the postmodern with Nietzsche, in the way that JP2 talks about this turn from rationalism that eventually leads to nihilism. And then in the third section, some signs of hope for moving forward. So first section, classical music, is in the classical period from the ancient Greeks to the medieval. Socrates defines music as logos, harmonia, and rhythmos. Logos refers to the speeches that are to be set to sound, but also to the intelligible content being conveyed. Harmonia can be translated as either melody or harmony, and these are understood to be the conduits by which sound invokes the passions. And rhythmos is the presentation of both logos and harmonia in terms of temporal patterns that allows them to be conveyed. Yet, because melody and harmony cannot determine which passions are appropriate at any given time, and because rhythm focuses only on the rational and numerical measures of sound, rather than whether a given syllable should be pronounced long or short, reason is the foundational component of music. When these three are put together, or better, when logos governs the other two, the soul is made docile, and as a result, receptive to the liberal arts education that awaits it. While Socrates did not organize the liberal arts in precisely this way, his thinking is compatible with the later organization into trivium and quadrivium. We can see the speech of a song is governed by the trivium, the discovery and creation of goodness in grammar, truth in logic, and beauty in rhetoric. In more advanced studies, melody and harmony and rhythm are governed by the mathematical ratios studied in the quadrivium, which reveal the structure of nature. Thus, music is a liberal art as mathematics in motion, as the ordering of instruments to the order of the body, and this for the sake of the ordering of the body to the order of the soul, which in turn makes possible the soul's ordering to the cosmos, that itself is a reflection of the order given by the divine Logos. We are now in a position to see why our translation of Logos' speech must be qualified. For this divine Logos that governs the cosmos is the measure of human Logos. Logos gives rise to human speeches, but itself might be better called order, reason, or intelligibility. The cosmos is infused with divine Logos, and the goal of music is to order our body and soul so that they reflect its order. The variety of things and laws found in nature are harmonized to and by divine Logos, and music helps the human soul tune itself by its own human Logos, a ruler within, that in discovering this order and intelligibility in the cosmos can pattern itself on its divine ruler. Music invokes docility or silence before the divine Logos, so that in a wordless state, human Logos can begin to speak rightly. Human Logos is that which produces the speech that governs melody, harmony, rhythm, ordering the three of these to the divine. This is why certain melodic intervals and rhythmic patterns are acceptable and others are not. For only those which can be used in speeches produced under the guidance of human Logos, as united with the divine, are capable of harmonizing the soul to cosmos and creator. Given this understanding of the nature of music, we are prepared to grasp Boethius's claim, or Aristides Quintilianus, that we usually think of as music is one of the three kinds. Our instrumental music is ordered to human music, ethics, and human music to cosmic music. Since order and harmony are fundamental givens of reality, music is at the heart of creation. In Platonic terms, we can keep our Homer in the city if we treat as compatible the passages in which dawn spreads her fingertips of rose, and the key moment when Hermes reveals to Odysseus the phusis, the nature of the moly plant. The discovery of nature as relations of ordered harmony is the discovery of the hidden reason behind the gods' doings. Both Homer and Plato reveal a cosmic symphony with its all-embracing attunement, upon which the pagan world can model itself, and to which Christians can appeal when they proclaim the gospel. From the cyclical motions of the planets to the four seasons, from the songs of birds to the cicadas droning, the study of this music will come to be called science. And in this classical world, it is not in conflict with either the arts or religion. I'm going to skip the second kind, morality, essentially, is the second kind of music. Third and finally is the ordered harmony of instruments, both natural, the human voice, and artificial, lyres and flutes and so forth, such that they can imitate both the cosmic and human musics for the sake of helping us establish within ourselves, within our homes and within our cities, the order and harmony of nature. In this, it is a handmaid to human music. It is physician helping to tune the passions to reason when we are young, and helping to maintain or adjust us through life's journey. For the unhealthy masses, always on the verge of sickness, music is purgative, releasing them from pent-up passions that may otherwise lead them to harm themselves and others, and lead to stasis. For the few virtuous citizens, it provides a form of intellectual delight that both relaxes and strengthens the mind. The study of this music is simply called music. And we could conclude by defining it as the ordering of speech, melody, and harmony and rhythm for the sake of tuning humans with the world, so that they can in turn be receptive to the divine logos which creates and orchestrates it. One brief caveat before looking at the modern view. Admittedly, there's a tension here between upholding music as a liberal art and assigning to it a medicinal role. Music seems to be a pharmacon, a cure as much as a poison. The masses need it because they cannot be made healthy, and the virtuous would arguably be better off if they did not resort to it once their education is complete. Once our passions have been tuned to reason, it would seem that we have no need of music. Put differently, if music only imitates the human logos in its efforts to set up in itself an image of the divine, then it is below philosophy, and so not worthy of the philosopher's affection. Arguably, this is where Christianity enters as a corrective to this view of music, helping us to see that because divine mythic speech elevates us above human rational speech, there is the possibility of a type of music that is higher than philosophy, one that both silences us before God and allows us to speak in his own words. Thus, the Benedictine nun Elizabeth Paul Labat can speak of music as the homeland of mystery, the echo of an unknown world beyond clear ideas and defined feelings. This is the worship of music called chant, and we could perhaps even say that it is either higher than theology, or that it is the theology of which the scholastic variety is an imitation. So now the modern view. Machiavelli's Mandragola is a good place to start. Let's go back to Florence. For our understanding of how the modern view of the good life as mastery over nature and liberation of human desire would play itself out in the world of art. In it, the lustful Calimico, aided by an aphrodisiac, a businessman, and a corrupt priest, seduces a young wife who has herself been duped into thinking that this is God's will for her. When the speeches of poetry serve a philosophy of power and making desire as big as possible, the melodies and harmonies and rhythms of music follow suit. It is not hard to see how such a view dovetails nicely with nihilism's rejection of objectivity and ethics, and its holding up of man as creator of values. Yet it does not necessarily entail the rejection of the existence of natural order. So let's briefly look at a view of music that serves as a halfway house between the classical and the what we might call postmodern. The modern view need not reject the existence of laws of nature, but only purpose to the order and harmonizing of the cosmos. Either because it piously asserts that God's ways are not our ways, and thus we cannot through reason know his designs, or because it rejects the existence of providence, as in deism. This view can uphold a strict fact-value distinction that would allow music to retain the mathematical foundations of the classical view, but also liberate its speech from subordination to nature. Thus, Descartes can still write his Compendium Musicae as a study of mathematical ratios that produce passions in the soul. If the soul can only be harmonized with the cosmos in terms of its intellectual commitments, but not in terms of the passions, then music can imitate the cosmic music discovered by human reason, while also imitating the human music created by the will. This partial severing of man from the cosmos manifests itself in education as the wall of separation between liberal arts, ordered toward philosophy and theology, and the empirical sciences, ordered toward mathematics and physics. Such a music still accepts melody and harmony and rhythm as normative, but it does not necessarily follow Socrates' adage that they should follow speech. The liberation of desire leads to a music that celebrates the passions, alongside one that models itself on scientific speech, thus replacing the classical music for the masses versus music for the virtuous distinction with a different distinction, orgiastic and self-controlled, music for democracies. This is precisely where Nietzsche enters the picture, for he unmasks the modern musical theorist's claims to science as the all-too-human will to power. In showing the fact-value distinction to be itself the product of human valuing, this philosophizing with a hammer completes the modern task of asserting domination over nature as the goal. Nature is not only bereft of purpose, but also irrational and disordered. Chaos is primordial, and thus the so-called laws of nature either emerge from randomness or are the projections of the human mind in its quest to use the material world for commodious living. Nietzsche makes explicit, then, that both the humanities and the sciences are imposed on nature, thus liberating the musician to either create new melodies and harmonies or to reject the normativity of these for the sake of revealing the abyss behind human meaning-making, clearing the way for the creation of new values for shaping the world. The nihilist philosophy described here dominates contemporary America and Europe's intellectual and cultural life. Though admittedly, holdouts remain who either adhere to the older fact-value distinction or to the classical view, especially among religious believers. Before looking at the signs of life for the classical view, let us briefly consider Josef Pieper's analysis of modernity in music. Those familiar with Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture, or his complementary In Tune with the World, could anticipate the general framework of his philosophy of music. In Only the Lover Sings, he contrasts celebratory and two types of nihilistic music. This listening silence that celebratory music creates attunes one to interiority. At its highest level, it is nonverbal articulation of weal and woe, wordless expression of man's intrinsic dynamism of self-realization, in a word, love. Pieper here brings out a way of resolving the tension we discussed earlier between music and philosophy. The speech of music is not that of human logos, nor of a rational desire, but of human will as purified by the love that is the divine logos. Celebratory music is not in competition with philosophy, which itself must acknowledge with Aquinas that the love of the things that are above us, especially of God, ranks before the knowledge of such things. Just as the modern world has turned things on their head in asserting the primacy of work over leisure, so has it created music that attempts to celebrate man as maker of his own reality. This music seeks to unleash raw passion and replace the classical elevation of the will in the lover with the will as creator God. Having rejected the very idea of an order that binds the human soul to creation and creator, it is written for those who see the entire realm of music as mere amusement. Its first and most prevalent mode is that of the happy sound, sheer banality, the view that there's really nothing to worry about. In its second mode, modern music produces the rhythmic beat of a certain crude and orgiastic music, a music for slaves, music of the numbing beat. These forms of music correspond to and are the false cure for the worker's achadia, sloth, for they are means of satisfying without success the boredom and existential void that are caused and increased by each other and that are common and pervasive today. Finally, modern music is consumed as a means of escapism, of a certain pseudo-deliverance, and thus it is nihilistic. Having rejected God, even the great music today is rooted in a despairing parody of creation, and Western music is the history of a soul's degeneration. While Pieper does not provide examples of these alarming modes of modern music, in his time we could point to Frank Lesser's Baby It's Cold Outside as an example of music of the happy sound, Glenn Miller's In the Mood as the numbing beat, and John Cage's 433, or perhaps his sonatas and interludes, as nihilistic music. Today the examples are legion, though Foster the People's Pumped Up Kicks serves as a fine example of the happy sound, Kesh's Tick-Tock as the numbing beat, and Philip Glass's Violin Concerto No. 2, The American Four Seasons, or Richard Barrett's Dark Matter as nihilistic music. Despite his grave warnings about the degrading path Western civilization is on, Pieper surprises us with a sudden burst of joy. We observe and ponder all this, and then are moved to rejoice as we become aware again and acknowledge anew that among all the various kinds of music today, there still exists also and especially the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. We still have classical music with us, and listening to it can renew our commitment to the good, the true, and the beautiful, thus inspiring composers to bring forth new works that express every man's desire to give birth within the soul to wordless jubilation. So let me end with, again, signs of hope. It's all too easy, especially as one gets older, to let criticism and pessimism carry the day, to pine for the good old days and despair at the signs of civilization's imminent collapse. Maybe our age is one in which Will Durant's warning that civilizations are destroyed from within should be taken seriously. Yet one of the many fruits of immersing oneself in classical literature and philosophy is being constantly reminded that we humans have been telling ourselves that decline is nigh for thousands of years. Focusing specifically on music, Homer's sirens were always out there waiting to devour the hardiest of heroes. Plato's Socrates worried that Homer and Hesiod had so corrupted the soul as to make the rule of reason only possible in speech. And his whole life was devoted to fighting false philosophers like Gorgias and charlatan musicians like Ion, who use reason, melody, and harmony rhythm as mask for the will to power. Aristotle feared that the flute's orgiastic sounds would erode civic life. Boethius was convinced that already in his time the human race had become utterly degraded, and he praised the ancient Spartans for expelling Timotheus from the city, for introducing an additional string to the lyre that made music more capacious. It was bad. Those who love order and harmony are always prepared for a swan song and perhaps a bit too eager to perform it. In closing, let me briefly mention 4 signs of hope in contemporary music. First, the dissatisfaction with the supposedly liberated life of desire is a common refrain in pop music. For example, MGMT's Time to Pretend. Second, the vibrant traditional music scene, especially Irish folk, old-timey, and bluegrass. And think of what the Hillbilly Thomas did in Nashville this last summer for the Knights of Columbus. Third, the shortness of atonalism's reign in classical music and the freedom with which both secular and religious composers can again speak of melody and resolution as the bases for music. And fourth, the attraction young Catholics have to attending masses with traditional hymns and Gregorian chant. Whenever we are moved in despair to proclaim that the end is nigh, let us join Merle Haggard's When a Buck Was Still Silver in seeing signs that, quote, the best of the free life is still yet to come, and the good times ain't over for good. Thank you.
Before we move on to questions, I just want to thank the panelists again and thank you for being here. Really appreciate the presentations, really thoughtful. So now we'll just open it up to questions, and if anybody has a question, I have some questions if nobody is willing. Right here.
So this is for Andrew Smith. Do you think that contemporary churches built in classical styles, such as the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, implement inferior materials and building techniques such that they only have a lifespan of 200 years, whereas more classical European structures last? So this is for Andrew Smith.
I think that's a great question.
Do you think
Thank
that contemporary churches built in classical styles,
It's something I think
such
about a
as
lot. I think
the
that
Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, implement
go to any college
inferior
campus in America during the
materials and
summertime,
building
you'll
techniques
see the
such
building that was
they
built in
only have a
1970
lifespan
being stripped down to
200
metal,
years, whereas
you know,
more classical European
I-beams,
structures last
rebuilt essentially
hundreds,
from
if not
scratch.
thousands of years.
Post-World War II, we've been building almost nothing but metal tents and living with the consequences of that. So it's very hard when you get into a contemporary culture, construction industry, all of these things, to actually go beyond that standard build of the 50-year amortization, for example, and to convince the client, the community, the engineers, everyone involved to actually build something durable. So there are some examples. My father was a prominent architect based here at Notre Dame in terms of the classical architecture revival. The monastery at Clear Creek, Oklahoma is literally, built to last 1,000 years. That's the insistence of the client, the monks there, who want that European model of permanence. And that involves masonry, it involves a different type of construction practice, all of these things that make it more expensive, make it much longer in terms of its construction phase. So the McCreary project with the 200-year build is so much more ambitious than almost anything else you'll see. So I think that's to give him and his client credit. And 200-year build is really different from a 40-year. So you can renew that perpetually, I would say. But I think it's an important factor. The environmental footprint of a building depends on whether you're rebuilding it every 30 years or not. You know, that kind of thing is important as well.
There's another right back here.
Yeah, this question is for Michael. I was wondering where you see film score. In like you had kind of three categories of modern music, but I didn't think it seemed to fit into any. Would you consider it as like maybe a moving forward still in art of the same type like Andrew was kind of advocating in sculpture?
Yeah, good question. Michael Couric is at,
this question
also
is
in
for
Nashville, actually.
Michael.
He's at
I was
Vanderbilt,
wondering where you
Catholic
see film
composer,
score.
professor
In, like,
there.
your three-
He has
you
a
had
second,
kind of three
second
categories of modern music, but I didn't think it seemed to fit
concerto
into any. Would
out.
you consider it as like
Concerto, I haven't gotten a chance to
maybe
really
a
listen to
moving
it
forward
much.
still in
That is
art
really
of the
based
same
on
type
kind of
Andrew was
fairy,
kind of advocating in sculpture?
Tolkien kind of images.
Yeah, good
And
question.
he insists that this is not music score, right? That it might sound to you like music score for a movie, and you're going to picture scenes from The Lord of the Rings or something like that. But he really wants to insist that I'm doing something that is higher than that. That it's if it is program music, it's freed from that kind of being bound to the story told in the movie. So I think while motion picture soundtracks are a good example in which we recognize that melody and harmonization that we want in the storytelling is guiding the music. I also think that that Couric is right to say that the pure composer is striving for something, higher than being bound by what the director's telling in his story. In a sense, the composer is telling his own story, and so pure classical music would be higher than that.
All right, we have a group over here. I think the back had his hand up a few times. Yeah, you're right there.
This is also for Professor Krom. I'm curious where in your classification you would place Arvo Pärt.
Yeah.
Yeah, whose work is at many moments not pleasant to listen to, but bathed in a religious sensibility, bathed in silence, beloved by Orthodox Christians, for instance.
Yeah, I think we put Stravinsky and Tavener in the same kind of thinking about the use of atonal, essentially. I was thinking in your paper about that, the rebel speech about things dissolving, that I think there is something about atonal that is recognizing that things do fall apart in this world. And at end times, we will have a great conflagration, right? But that is a refiner's fire for a higher melody and harmony. So it's one thing to say using atonal style or a non-Western musical theory in the name of chaos, and this is what I think this guy who wrote Dark Matter is saying. I think he's ultimately saying that chaos is primordial, and Arvo Pärt's not, right? He's saying that we will encounter chaos and darkness and evil. Christianity opens us up more to the reality of evil, I think, and we have to see it. But we don't go mad looking into the abyss, right? We see the divine logos is pulling us through that. And I don't know Pärt's music that well, but the one concert I heard at St. Vincent, convinced me, okay, I really do need to recognize that this is not always beautiful to listen to. It's very jarring, but he's clearly saying something beautiful, whereas I do think Philip Glass doesn't have anything to say. I think Glass just has nothing to say in the end. I'm open to that with Glass because I listened to that a few times last week, and maybe there's something there that I'm missing, but I don't think so. So great question.
Right over there on the left.
I also have a question for Michael. What would you say the role of modern, or how should we approach modern music today? Is there any value in it in terms of, because I think sometimes I'll find something of value in it, but it's more peppered with things that are just a product. I also have a question for Michael. What would you say the role of modern, or how should we approach modern music today? Is
Yeah,
there any
you made
value
me
in
think
it
of,
in terms of, because I think
I think you
sometimes
talked
I'll
about Leon
find
Cass's The Hungry Soul.
something
I'm
of
thinking
value
that,
in it,
yeah,
but
there's a
it's
time when you're on a road
it's
trip where you
more
stop at
peppered
Popeyes
with
for lunch and you just
things
have
that
some
are
junk food
just,
kind of stuff, And every once in a while, that's not going to really harm you. And there's some music that you might like that you say, this might not be high art, this might not be the most ennobling art, but it's also not morally corrupting, it's not degrading, it's for a certain kind of part of life, driving down the road. But it is important, just as in dining, right, that we generally have a healthy taking in of things and take stock of that to make sure that if we are, listening to music that is more pop and easy, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that, that it's that there's a stronger part of our diet for the music that challenges us and that goes further. And if we want to think of music in the liturgy, I think we could make a point there about really insisting that the music in the liturgy is purified from the theater, from pop culture. And I think that's part of what's attracting young Catholics. Going to the Divine Liturgy this morning is a great example, is that this really challenges us, opens us up to the transcendent in a way that the music of Broadway really doesn't make Broadway music bad. It just means it's not appropriate for Mass.
Right closer to here, yeah. Right there. Sorry.
Thank you. I think that this is primarily directed to Andrew Smith, but I think it could be interesting to get a quick thought on from all of you. The idea that historically what is brought into the temple is an offering to the gods. So votives and filling out the temples with votives and offerings, and they're not these stark white strip things that we.
Sorry.
Thank you. I think that this is primarily directed to Andrew Smith, but I think it could be interesting to get a quick thought on from all of you. The idea that historically what is brought into the temple is an offering to the gods. So votives and filling out the temples with votives and offerings, and they're not these stark white strip things that we kind of get in our picture history arts. And that carries through in the history of the church. So the artist who brings whose sculpting work is Krom. I'm sorry, I want to be as brief as possible. The slide of Salvador Dali and Thomas were the two striking ones. We said, well, this is more of perhaps the artist's contemplation.
The last part you said, who can?
Not necessarily something you like. The idea that maybe we're trying to put art into late Shakespeare, late Beethoven, in order to get the same, versus put late Michelangelo. This is a product more of a prayerful life.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I don't know
tension
exactly
with
what to do. I
wearing
think,
sculpting arts and thinking, well,
for one thing, I'm trying to make the observation that the 20th century mood, whether you like it or hate it, has kind of been rejected. And so, pragmatically, there are things we can do moving forward. My preference is for things that have more intellectual energy, more symbolic depth, and they need to combine those two qualities though with something. My teacher, one of my teachers, a great sculptor from Philadelphia, whenever we were in art circles going to the galleries on Friday nights and things like that, and people asked him what kind of art he made, he would always end the conversation before it started by saying, I make statues that old ladies kiss. And then people lost interest in him, in the art parties. And that is like an embrace of that position as an artist. It's a humble thing to do, I think, to say that it's not just kind of look at me, but we have to build a thing with a community, with a client that that allows for that kind of relationship. And also, though, I think that myself and the other artists I mentioned positively, we're doing this because of our interest in the artwork. We're artists and not just kind of artisans or whatever way. And so we are trying to put a little bit of something that we think is interesting, is engaging to ourselves into it. And if I couldn't put any of myself into these things, I would just probably do something else, So I think it's a matter of finding a balance, ultimately. And I don't know if you have anything to add, either of you.
Just thinking about the Tempest in terms of prayer, it is really striking. There's no other Shakespeare play where there's just such an emphasis. The prayer is spoken of so frequently as in the Tempest. From the opening scene to the epilogue as a kind of prayer. Right, and even that passage I quoted, Ferdinand, I want to know your name so I can put it in my prayers. At the same time, The Tempest is Shakespeare's work that is the most synthetic. I emphasize the Bible and the Aeneid as these two kind of master texts running through the play, right? But actually Shakespeare is bringing like all of his learning. There's no Shakespeare play where it seems to be that's more elusive than the Tempest. And in response to your question, I want to do something, bring those together. That Shakespeare as an artist here at the end of his career seemingly is very eclectic, and he's just bringing in everything and doing new things, and is open to this new influence and this strange thing where the Roman Baroque seems to be even influencing his poetic style. And yet that's all within the frame of an artwork that is about prayer. And that, I don't know, I have no idea how Shakespeare is thinking of his own work there, but it's as if the artist who works with whatever is there for him to make out of, but the whole thing is part of a larger prayer. I don't know.
Just say something to add on that from Benedict XIV in 1749 issues an encyclical for the Jubilee year coming up, and then up to Pius X on music, that the church is really trying to just think through that Mozart wants to offer music. Is it appropriate for Mass? And saying sometimes the music being written by even great composers is not for worship and should not be in the churches. And so both of them are seeing this and saying that there's a question of what this might be great music, but does that make it fit as an oblation to the Lord in part of worship? And Gregorian chant, insisting that Gregorian chant really is the music that is fitting to the liturgy. It's integrally part of the liturgy. And you could see something similar, I think, with art. It'd be interesting about Baroque architecture and music at this period, which I don't know as much about as I'd like, to say what are some of maybe the tensions between these developing ideas and the music and the liturgy. And it's not something I really know much about, but I know the church is concerned about moving away from the purity of the music and the liturgy.
All right, well, that'll end this session, and speakers will be here. If you want to, ask them questions later. And thank you all again. Really appreciate this. It's been great. Thank you.